The first way to answer the question, which one is harder, bachelor's, master's, or PhD, is to look at exactly what you do during the process of each. Now, in my undergraduate, the process of turning up to lectures was relatively easy. Like, I was young, I was carefree, sitting down in a boring room, listening to a boring lecture, writing some boring notes. It was boring, you may have guessed, but it was easy. I always said to myself that I would turn up to lectures no matter what. I drank a lot in my undergraduate years, and therefore I was quite often hungover, tired. There was lots of social activities, but I ensured that I was at the lecture every single time it started. I turned up. Turning up is part of the challenge, I guess, and the biggest hurdle to get over for a lot of people. So I turned up to lectures no matter what, and that was relatively easy. It was a bit boring when I was there. And the thing is undergraduate, it prepares you by giving you a lot of information about a lot of things. And so, of course, there were things that I didn't really like. I didn't really like electrochemistry. I did chemistry as an undergraduate. I didn't really like battery stuff. I didn't really like super hardcore physical chemistry. But I did it, I sat the exam, and that was it. And, in an undergraduate, that's kind of part of the process, is you sit, you absorb information, you learn that information, you learn to spill it out in an exam, and you're done. Whereas masters and PhD, in masters, there is sort of some lecture and exam components, but ultimately, in a PhD and masters, the thing that's the biggest difference is the fact that you have to do research. The daily process isn't about turning up and sitting down in an exam. It's about sort of like motivating yourself to find out new things about the world. And that can be very, very challenging to actually sit down and, motivate yourself to answer a problem that no one else has answered before and come up with the techniques, come up with the way to answer it in a sensible, scientific or research-based way. It's kind of difficult, and I found that, I think, far more difficult than my undergraduate, because I had no kind of direction, I think, during the research process. My supervisor was there, but ultimately it was up to me to control my day. And I think that's another thing. In undergraduate, it's like, here are some lectures. You are turning up here, 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 at these times, at these places, be there. Whereas with research, you need to kind of like create your own schedule, which can be very difficult for some people. So looking at exactly what you need to do in terms of the daily life of an undergraduate, master students, and PhD, I would say that a PhD is much more difficult because it's unstructured. There's no kind of like end in sight immediately. When you turn up to a lecture, you're like, I know, even though this is a bit boring, I'm going to be out of here in about 45 minutes to an hour, and I can go on and do other things. Whereas, research in your master's and your PhD is much more long term. It's less structured, and that can be very sort of confronting when you first are faced with it, and you're like, oh no, everything I did up until now, I was told what to do, but now I'm kind of just at a bit of a loose end. Help! This video is brought to you by my newsletter. Go check it out at andrewstapleton.com.au/newsletter. The link is in the description. When you sign up, you'll get 5 emails over about 2 weeks. Everything from the tools I use, the podcasts I've been on, my TEDx talk, and more. It's exclusive content only available on that newsletter, so go sign up now. And I'm in the process of writing my second ebook, and you'll get a nice little tasty discount into your email inbox. Another way to look at this question is, what do you need to achieve at the end? And for my undergraduate, my bachelor's, I was very, very good at sitting exams in the end. I was able to absorb information, learn it during like a cramming session, 2 weeks or so, or a month out from the exams, sit the exam, and then kind of like forget that information, and it's gone, and then I'm on to the next exam. And I trained myself to become relatively good at that. In my undergraduate years, the first year, second year, I wasn't so great at it, but then I kind of like, this is the trick. Active recall is something that is really powerful, and I used it a lot. I used to get an A4 piece of paper, write everything I need to know about a certain topic, turn it over, and try to recall everything that's on the other side of that paper based on a question, based on, a potential exam question that may come up. And that was the way I got a first class undergraduate degree with honors. It was, something that I had perfected, and the outcome is very easy to achieve because you know what's expected of you in an undergraduate. Some people can achieve the same result I did with a lot less work. One of my friends actually ended up with a very good sort of degree by doing like 1/10 of the work. I couldn't believe it, but I knew what I needed to do to pass. I'd learned that over the course of my undergraduate, and exams, I got very, very good at them. And I think a lot of people that do well in undergraduate, they learn the tricks. They learn that you have to sort of like squeeze the information in. And it's not necessarily about understanding a lot of stuff. It's about putting the right words in the right order or the right equations, or learning the path to get a result and then spilling that out in the exam. And I find that quite easy in the end. Research, on the other hand, in a master's or PhD, the outcome for your master's is a short research paper and to complete some exams. The short research paper is actually something that, a project's been put together, and it's kind of going to work. No one's going to give a master's student a pie in the sky idea that doesn't work. So even within a master's degree, there's a degree of safety in terms of the research that you're doing. And then when you go to your PhD, it is something that no one has done before. You're generating new knowledge, you're finding gaps in the research field, and you're trying to fill them, and you're doing new things. With new things come new challenges, and ultimately at the end of 3, 4, 5, even 7+ years, you need to create a thesis, or at the moment, you can also get a PhD by producing peer-reviewed papers in recognized journals within your field that have been looked over by the peers in your field and say, yes, this is good data, publish it. And that is very, very challenging. Once again, it comes back to that kind of timing thing where in your undergraduate, you're like, I've got exams on this date and I need to revise for them. Great. With a PhD, I certainly felt like there was never an end goal, and that's the thing about research. There never actually is an end. You continue researching forever. That's what people base their whole PhD and academic careers on. And you need to produce so much new novel information and present it in a way that the research body of your university says, yes, this person deserves our PhD. And that is just very different. I think what is harder for me is the research component, what needs to be done at the end. Writing a thesis is very, very difficult. It is time consuming. It is laborious. The type of language you use is very dense and academic, whereas the undergraduate sit in an exam is relatively easy compared to that, I think. That's my impression. Let me know in the comments what you think. But that's not the end of the story. We've talked about the nuts and bolts of doing a master's, an undergraduate, a bachelor's, or a PhD. But there's stuff going on in your head, and that's where I think there's a little bit of a difference between the nuts and bolts and what you are feeling. For me, my bachelor's was far more difficult in terms of expectations I had on myself and the expectations on people from the outside than my PhD. A PhD is like pass or fail. You're not ranked necessarily amongst your peers. You just say, yeah, you've got a PhD, congratulations. But with exams and standardized testing, you are kind of just ranked against everyone else, and you can feel a lot of stress to do your best. And then when other people beat you, but your whole identity is wrapped up in being this clever person, it can really sort of play havoc with your mental health, how you feel about yourself, your self-identity, all of that sort of stuff. So in my bachelor's, I had built up my own identity based on being clever, whatever that meant. And what that meant at the time was passing exams and doing really well. Now, I didn't particularly do very well in the UK in my A-levels, which is sort of the end of school exams, but I had convinced myself that to redeem myself, I would have to do very, very well in my undergraduate. And yes, I got a first-class degree with honors, but I think I had a lot of expectations on what I would do. I worked my hardest. I would always make sure that I revised so hard that I would be in the top of the class. Now, I tried my absolute hardest all the time. I revised super well. And I think with that and the expectations I set on myself comes a lot of stress and anxiety. And because you are ranked against other people, where did you come in the class? Are you at the top? Are you at the bottom? Did you get a first, second, third, fourth, whatever it is? In the UK, we have like first, 2-1, 2-2, a third, and then I think a fail or diploma underneath that. But I was always aiming for a first. No matter every year at the end, I wanted to be right at the top of the cohort. And there were some very clever people at Swansea University, and so I tried my absolute hardest. The thing about masters and a PhD is that ultimately, at the end, you are given one or not. In the PhD world, the process is very sort of like loose and open. And as long as you produce a thesis at the end, everyone goes, oh, okay, yeah, that's worth a PhD. There, tick, there we are, great, you've got one. And that was far more relaxing for me in terms of what I thought about myself along the way. Because if you make a mistake or you want to sort of like slack off for a little bit, you can. And no one's there to say, well, there's an exam coming up. There's not that constant pressure. That makes it difficult from a doing perspective, but it makes it much easier from an internal mental health perspective. And so I found my undergraduate much harder because of the expectations and the continuous ranking that was performed during standardized testing at the end of each year or even each semester. Compared to my PhD, where I kind of knew I'd get there in the end. And it was, being a PhD student, that itself in its identity was, satisfying my need to be the clever person and people to go, oh, you're clever. So that kind of made that whole process much easier until the very end when I had to write up. But once again, I kind of knew I'd get there. I didn't know if it would take me a few months or maybe a year, but I knew I'd get there. So yes, the internal process is very different between the two. And I find my undergraduate much more stressful. If you are a person who loves structure, then your bachelor's undergraduate will be much nicer to you than a master's or PhD. Master's, you've got some ability to structure some of the time, but ultimately a PhD is an open-ended amount of time where you have to do something new, and it's only sort of like regular checks in with your PhD supervisor that keeps you on track. Whereas with an undergraduate in your bachelor's, you are told exactly where to be, exactly what time, exactly what exams to sit, what textbooks you need to read, what information you need to get into your head. And the level of structure between the two is very, very different. In fact, I would say that it's polar opposites of the structure scale. In your PhD at the end of your first year, they're like, oh, we'll do a confirmation year, then we'll check in regularly. That's about it until the end. In your bachelor's, it's like daily, it's like schedule. Okay, this lecture, this time, this lecturer, this topic, this exam, these books, these questions. If you are a person that really enjoys the structure and really struggles without the structure, your PhD is going to be much harder. Now, I really liked the structure because it gave me something to work with, but I also didn't mind having my own time. I've always really enjoyed that, which is why I've ended up doing what I'm doing right now. So, for me, plus and minuses in both. And ultimately, it came down to the stage of life that I was in during each time. So let's talk about that. Typically, but not all the time, people do an undergraduate when they are much younger. A PhD normally follows after undergraduate, masters, or just, like an M-Chem or whatever I did. I didn't do bachelor's, masters. I did a straight undergraduate masters called an M-Chem. And then I launched into a PhD. And typically, people get older during that process. But sometimes, if you're doing a PhD, you can go back to undergraduate. I know someone who did that. Insane. I would never do it. I can't imagine. Anyway, I don't want to think about it. It's too stressful. But yes, so typically in your undergraduate, you are younger. And I tell you what, I was much more carefree. And I think we all are when we're younger. And going to university to do an undergraduate, there were lots of other people doing it. So it felt like the socially acceptable thing to do. I was there, I was learning about chemistry and science, and there was a process. I was going to go through it in 4 years' time. I was going to be kicked out the other side with a master's in chemistry, and then I would do whatever I wanted to do afterwards. And the age that I was at, I didn't mind sharing houses with people. I worked, very menial jobs. One of my favorite jobs was working in the library as a nighttime assistant, where essentially I sat at a desk and said, you can take your books out over there, and stopped people having sex in the bottom of the library, which I caught 1 or 2, you sneaky buggers. But in my PhD, I was starting to get older. And I was starting to mature a little bit, although maybe it didn't feel like it for the people around me. I was maturing somewhat. And it just, the expectations on you at that stage of life are very, very different. In your PhD, you are starting to want the adult stuff in life. And because not a lot of people do a PhD, they've all kind of done undergraduate and they're starting off. You are now this kind of person you kind of feel like you've been kept back at school. You are older than other people in the school, in the university, and you're not any further ahead in terms of your life. You may still be sharing, living in a share house with people. You may be not having a car. You certainly don't have much money if you decide to do a PhD, and you certainly feel like you're left behind in life. And that sense I never got as an undergraduate. I only got it during my PhD. So you are delaying adult life. You are holding yourself back a little bit so you can study and get this super high degree that ultimately, only really matters if the industry that you're going into rewards it, or you're going to become an academic. And that is very different. An undergraduate, a lot of people do it. You're young. Everyone's in this boat together, and then you become this little isolated, lonely researcher, and you are just delaying everything that everyone else has kind of worked hard in their undergraduate to get. And you kind of feel like the dumb kid that's been kept back at school for a little bit, especially when people ask you, so how's university going? And you're like, oh no, it's like research, it's like a job. And they're like, oh, very good. They don't know. So yes, it's very different in terms of the age. And I think I preferred my bachelor's was much easier on me than my PhD because of the stage in life I was at and the expectations that society had on me and where I wanted to be at that stage in terms of my life progression. So yes, what a mixed bag. So there we have it. There are all of the big angles from which I think you can look at your bachelor's, master's, and PhD. Let me know in the comments what you would add. And also go check out academiainsider.com. That's my project where I've got my ebooks, the Ultimate Academic Writing Toolkit, as well as the PhD Survival Guide, and my Insider Forum where we help each other become better academics and people. All right then, I'll see you in the next video.